But first, the Palaszczuk government introduced a radical bill earlier this month at the behest of trans activists that, if passed, will see biological males who identify as female being allowed into female-only spaces in Queensland without any reassignment surgery. That could mean not just male bodies in female change rooms, prisons, shelters, but also competing against women in female sporting competitions. It's little wonder that Women's Forum Australia are calling on the Palaszczuk government to respect and protect the rights of women. They say this legislation elevates gender identity over biological reality and also over women's and children's safety and common sense. Their press release continues. The Minister for Women is burying her head in the sand. She has told women's advocates there is no evidence in Australia or internationally to suggest that trans women pose an increased danger to cisgender women. First, we are not cisgender women, just women. We are not a subset of our own sex class. And they go on to mention cases overseas where women have been harmed in what should be safe women-only spaces by predators self-identifying as female. I'll speak to the CEO of Women's Forum Australia shortly. Now, the Queensland Government is keen to paint this bill as simply a way to modernise birth certificates to recognise our diverse community. Who could possibly oppose that? But rest assured, the slippery slope is real, as we have seen in the UK, where criminals, including sexual predators, have been able to self-identify as female and be sent to a woman's prison. In the case of Karen White, you can see there, that particular predator went on to sexually assault a number of female prisoners, is now serving life in a male prison. And in Victoria, which is home to some of the most radical trans laws anywhere, earlier this year I was contacted by female prisoners from Victoria's biggest women's prison, the Dame Phyllis Frost Correctional Centre, who are terrified by a sexual predator with a history of abusing women and children being placed in their prison. The women have pleaded with authorities to remove the transgender prisoner, but have thus far been ignored. They stress they have no concern about transgender individuals, but are concerned this inmate has a working penis and a history of violent sexual assaults against women and children. In a petition, the women write, "We feel threatened, unsafe, distressed and traumatised with this current situation." So to sum it up here, we have a sexual predator who has attacked women and children, transferred to a women's prison full of vulnerable women, many of whom have been victims of sexual assault and carry significant trauma. Now, here to discuss this is Rachael Wong. She is CEO of the Women's Forum Australia. Thank you for joining me, Rachael. Explain why this bill in Queensland is not good for women.
Thank you for having me, Rita. This bill in Queensland is deeply concerning for a number of reasons. As you've noted, what it will do is it will allow any person to change their legal sex with a simple declaration. What the bill effectively does is erase sex as a legal concept. It allows men, for example, to identify as women, to simply make a declaration and then be allowed to identify into women-only prisons, bathrooms, hospital wards, domestic violence refuges, and so on. And obviously, this person may say they're a woman, they may feel like a woman, but the research shows us, the evidence shows us, that patterns of male criminality do not change just because somebody says that they are a member of a different sex. And not only that, women's relative physical vulnerability to males also doesn't change. So what this bill does is it changes the law and attempts to change reality for all Queenslanders in a way that really puts women and girls at grave risk. The UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls has only recently pointed out the potential for these laws to be abused by sexual predators. And as you mentioned, and obviously we've also been working on the situation in Victoria with the prisons, as you've mentioned, sexual offenders in other states are already being allowed to self-identify with these kinds of laws into women's prisons, where women are obviously extremely vulnerable and where these women also often have histories of sexual abuse and sexual violence. And that's the other thing with this bill, like the legislation itself is extremely harmful, but the context surrounding it, the fact that it's actually the Minister for Women who's introducing it, who is also the Minister for the Prevention of Domestic Violence, is just absolutely insane, to be honest. And the fact that she won't listen to women's advocates, she's blocked at least one woman's email. She's refused meetings with others. She's introduced this bill during the holiday period,
Yes.
Where it's going to be very difficult for people to make submissions. She clearly doesn't want consultation on this law.
Now, what did she say to the advocates when they presented their objections? Because you're right, she's not only the Minister for Women, she's also the Queensland Attorney General. So what was her response to your concerns?
So basically, to several women's advocates and women's groups, she said that she has been advised that there is no evidence that transgender women, so that's biological males, pose any greater risk to cisgender women. And as I said in my press release, I and many other women actually take issue with that term cisgender woman, because we're not cisgender women. We're just women. We're not a subset of our own sex class. And her saying that there is no evidence is just simply not true. And we've seen cases now just this year where trans women, so that's trans identified males, have been, raping women in women's only hospital wards, in women's only prisons. There's allegations of it happening in rape crisis centres. And obviously that's not to say that all trans identified males are rapists, just like not all men in general are rapists. But as I mentioned earlier, male patterns of criminality do not change just because a man says he's a woman or identifies as a woman. And women's physical vulnerability vis-a-vis men also does not change.
It's just incredible that the priorities are just so skewed one way. It's whatever is in the interest of the trans prisoners as opposed to the vulnerable women in prison. And as you mentioned, many of them are victims of sexual assaults in the past and they carry that trauma. Now, you mentioned in your press release that just as concerning as this particular bit of legislation is the concerted effort to ignore and silence women who oppose this legislation. And we're not just talking about the trans activists and the minister here. That kind of rhetoric is also very prevalent in the media.
That's right. You see in the media, as we've seen with other similar laws in Australia, you only ever see one side of the story. So obviously myself and other women's advocates are very grateful to people like you, Rita, for actually covering covering our side and for sort of allowing our voices to be heard, because the reality is when it comes to legislation like this, it's often the trans activist voices who are heard, and it's the men's voices who are the ones who want to self-identify into these women's spaces. It's their voices who are being heard, but not the voices of women.
Why do you think there is this vitriol from the activist class and the media towards people who are standing up for women's rights at the end of the day? It seems extraordinary that is no longer a priority for so many in the media who pretend that they are champions of women.
Yeah, that's right. I think a big part of it has to do with the fact that a lot of our media institutions are unfortunately very captured by this gender ideology, which says that, a male can be a female if he decides that he wants to be, if he believes that he is. And I think some people genuinely see this as an issue of tolerance and inclusivity, and they're trying to do what's right. I think others have, signed up to various diversity and inclusion schemes where they need to tell a particular side of the story. And if they do try to tell another side, then they're seen as, not being inclusive. And, that's exactly what happened to Sal Grover, I think, on an ABC interview recently. She was meant to talk about these bills on ABC, and the trans activists came out and said, well, that's not going to be a balanced interview because there's not a trans person. Whereas in reality, there are conversations had about these kinds of laws and situations all the time where women aren't represented and people aren't kind of calling that out constantly and having interviews cancelled. So it's very one-sided the way things are, panning out.
It is. The activists have a disproportionate voice and very mainstream opinions held by the majority of the population, I would say, not just the majority of women, seem to be sidelined. It's astonishing. Rachael Wong, thank you so much for joining me tonight.